This is a Dutch testing report tutorial to assist with the interpretation of results. This is for educational information only and not to be taken as medical advice. Please do note also that the results that we're showing on the screen are not from your actual patient here, although we will discuss some of the generalities of the results that you may have. As we're looking at these cortisol results, the primary bit of information, because there's a lot of information here, but the primary bit of information that we want to look at first is the free cortisol pattern. So we're looking at cortisol 4 times throughout the day. The waking sample tells us what the cortisol is doing while you're sleeping, and then the morning sample shows us the first 2 hours of the day at which there's supposed to be this fairly significant surge of cortisol, which is then gone, and the results are back down usually in the afternoon, and then usually at their lowest around bedtime. And then we're going to add those 4 values up, which gives you an idea of the total throughout the day. So in this particular case, the free cortisol is very high overall. So firstly, we want to look at the diurnal pattern to see what it looks like, to see when the cortisol is actually high. Is it high all day? Does it still have that up and down pattern? When we look at the free cortisol, though, it's not the best marker for production. It's a marker for circulating cortisol, but when it comes to how much cortisol did you make throughout the day, the free cortisol is only about 1%. The metabolites represent about 75%, so that's really your better marker for overall cortisol production. And in a case like this, the free cortisol is extremely high, and the metabolites, the production, is either high or also extremely high. So we want to look at the degree of those elevations. We also want to look at the time point at which it's high, because when these get really, really high, we also have to start thinking about, is this a case where we need to rule out Cushing's syndrome, right? And in Cushing's syndrome, one of the biggest tells is that night cortisol just doesn't come down, and it's very elevated, and usually elevated throughout the entire day. Typically, if that's happening, you would also see that pattern in, or at least something close, in the free cortisone. So cortisol is made by the adrenal gland in response to the signaling hormone from the brain called ACTH. When it's made, it then circulates as cortisol, but also as its inactive form, cortisone. So it goes back and forth between the two by an enzyme called 11-beta-HSD. So because it circulates as either form, we want to look at the free cortisol in both forms to kind of confirm what's going on. And then the cortisol is metabolized to cortisol and cortisone metabolites. And again, we're adding those up to have a marker for overall production. And in this case, those are really high too. Okay, so again, in this case, we may need to start thinking about ruling out some sort of situation like Cushing's disease, where there really is this huge production of cortisol. Obviously, if the patient is taking cortisol or hydrocortisone, that's going to change the interpretation. So we're looking at free cortisol over time. We're looking at the total of production. In other situations where either the free cortisol or the metabolites are very different from one another, which is not necessarily the case here, we may even want to think about whether there's an issue in terms of cortisol clearance. So if there's low cortisol clearance, maybe there's low thyroid, maybe there's poor liver function. If we've got excess cortisol clearance, like obesity is a good example of situations where oftentimes you'll see low free cortisol and elevated metabolites. That's the type of picture you can get in obesity, elevated thyroid, long-term exposure to elevated cortisol, those sorts of situations. But again, with this case, it's kind of a high across the board picture, and we need to confirm that, and then maybe think about what's causing that and what's driving that. The other thing that we may want to look at here is whether there's a preference for cortisol staying in its active form or whether it's readily deactivated to cortisone. It's most intuitive to just look at the totals of these, right? Which one's higher, the free cortisol or the free cortisone? But the scientific literature would suggest that the better way to ask that question is to look at the metabolites. And that's what this index says. It says, do I have more of an abundance of cortisol, the active form, in terms of metabolites, or an abundance of cortisone metabolites? And which way that leans can somewhat shape the interpretation of what's going on. For example, in a case like this where everything's kind of high, if that points more towards cortisone, that kind of makes sense, right? You see a lot of cortisol. What's your body want to do? It wants to get rid of it by deactivating. If, on the other hand, it's pointing more towards cortisol, that could really exacerbate things and exacerbate the clinical symptoms that go along with having elevated cortisol, because that means it's really hanging out most in its active form. So with cortisol, we want to look at the whole picture. The free hormone over time, the total of production, and then any metabolic preference that there might be. So if you have other questions, you might see DutchTest.com. We have other educational videos. If you have questions from the perspective of a patient, please do see your healthcare provider with those, and we thank you for testing with us.